Good morning, everyone, to those of you joining us in Canada, and good afternoon to those of you logging on from Europe. My name is Kathy Murphy, and I'm the Vice President of UCAN, and you are very welcome to our webinar today. This is another in our series, Access to Market, and today we'll be discussing CETA and all you need to know about consumer goods. Before I introduce our speaker, just a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will have a Q&A at the end of the session, so our presenter will do his full presentation. You're very welcome to populate the Q&A function as the webinar proceeds, and we'll take your questions in order at the end of the session. We'll leave a good 15 to 20 minutes for your important questions and feedback as well. So I am very pleased to welcome my colleague, Christian Sivière of Solimpex. Following a 30-year career in international logistics in Europe and Canada, Christian started a Montreal-based import-export consultancy in 2010. He is a subject matter expert and lectures for the Canadian International Freight Forwarders Association and the World Federation of International Freight Forwarders. He gives conferences for various trade organizations and personalized training for importers and exporters. Indeed, some of you may have been at some of those conferences and benefited from his expertise. You may also read his articles in Inside Logistics and in Supply Professional. So without further ado, I'm very happy to pass it over to our moderator today and keynote speaker, Christian.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and welcome everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. In fact, it's already the afternoon in Nova Scotia and in Newfoundland, so even some Canadians are on that time. So I'm really happy to be here, and I'd like to thank Kathy and the UCAN team for the invitation to speak about CETA and consumer goods. Kathy introduced me already kindly, so I don't need to spend time on that slide. I do want to say briefly to explain why I choose that background that you see here. It's because it's the colors of the flag of the Ukraine, and so I'd like to make a little note of that, a little mention of that we should not forget what's going on and not get used to it and not find this to be the new normal. Absolutely not. And so we must do all that we can to support the Ukraine. So what did we prepare today? We're going to talk about consumer goods, and one of the reasons we chose consumer goods is because, you know, these products, it covers a variety of products that you see here on the screen, but it's actually the products that benefit the most from the CETA agreement in terms of the tariff reduction or tariff elimination, because with the exception of perhaps dairy, which is quite specific, quite special, and some food preparations, these products these consumer goods are the ones that benefit the most because they're the ones that had the highest tariffs prior to CETA. And so this is what we'll look at today. We'll look at these different products, what the tariffs were, i.e. what are the savings that are generated by the CETA and the agreement, as well as the opportunities. And also we'll drill into the rules of origin a little bit, because I found by experience that the rules of origin is sometimes the trickiest part of a free trade agreement, and many companies, particularly SMEs, don't always understand how they work and where to find the information. And so that's why we'll link for every type of product that we have here that you see here on screen. We'll link we'll make the link to the information about the rules of origin, and we'll end with a small part on the mutual recognition of conformity assessments. I'll show you what that means and where to find the information. And I always like to end on a short discussion or presentation on the advantages of serving the US market from a Canadian base. And so I think this is also a great advantage, an indirect advantage of the CETA agreement. The CETA agreement provides great advantages for European companies to enter the Canadian market, but indirectly it also creates opportunities, because doing for a European company to do business in Canada, then it becomes very easy to do business in the United States. And so we'll end on that. I'll have a couple of slides on that at the end, and then we'll have a Q&A, and I'll be, of course, very happy to exchange with you and answer any questions that you may have. And so just a very brief reminder of the sort of historical perspective and also the main components of the CETA Free Trade Agreement when it comes to the selling and buying of products, the importing and exporting of goods. We know that the agreement has been in effect since September 2017, so we're soon going to have the anniversary, the 6-year anniversary in a few months. We know the main component is the rules of origin, because we have to be, in order for our European products to qualify for the CETA agreement, we have to make sure we meet the rules of origin. And so once we know that we meet the rules of origin, the European exporter has to provide a so-called origin certification. You see it at the bottom left. There's a specific format to follow. It does not have to be on a specific form, but it has to have specific information, and that's usually incorporated in the commercial invoice. For our European exporters to be able to do this self-certification of the origin and of the compliance with the rules of origin, we have to be registered under the REX, the EU REX system, for any transactions over 6,000 euros. And you see here in the center, there's a protocol on the rules of origin and origin procedures, and then you see how it's broken down. The main component is Annex 5, the product-specific rules of origin. And then when it comes to textiles, and we'll touch on that at the end, there's also specific annexes that deal with textiles. You'll see textiles and apparel is the category of products that has the most complex rules of origin. So we'll look at that as well in a moment. And so here, zooming into on the rules of origin, I just want to emphasize the fact that, of course, if our products fall under category A or B, i.e. they are 100% European, then we don't have to worry about the rules of origin. I mean, it goes without saying. The important point here is C, the last one at the bottom, and to know that there's specific rules of origin that enable us to have foreign content, to have some foreign input, non-EU inputs, raw materials, parts, components, as long as the output, as long as what we're going to export is going to be different through the manufacturing process, through the transformation of the product, through the manufacturing process or assembly. And so this is what I want to zoom in just a little bit to make sure that you're familiar with this and how it works. And that's because I can tell you from experience that not so many companies really understand how this works. So just to recap, the product-specific rules of origin, they enable our products to still be qualified, even though they may have foreign components, non-EU content. And so how the rules of origin are organized is according to the HS code, which is, as you probably know, an international numbering system of products that's issued by a great organization based in Brussels called the World Customs Organization. And so this numbering system is used everywhere around the world, and that's why it's the basis of the organizing of the rules of origin, because they vary depending on the product. And so the key, when you look for rules of origin, the key is to have the HS code of your finished product, and then see what the applicable rule is to that specific product. And so two principles that I want to go over very quickly to make sure they're clear. The first principle is that we can have foreign components as long as we transform them enough, as long as we change their nature, as long as the output is a different product than the input. And so to illustrate that, I use this example of bauxite, which is the raw material for aluminium. And so we can import bauxite and manufacture aluminium, and then our aluminium will be qualified for the free trade agreement. And that's because it has changed nature. It's a different product. And that's reflected in the change in the HS code. If you see the HS code for bauxite, it's completely different from the HS code of aluminium. Likewise, you could import aluminium and manufacture doors and windows, and your HS code would be different again. And so that goes with, any product you can think of. Like you could import, if you make these great Belgian chocolates that everyone enjoys around the world, including in Canada, right? The raw material is cocoa beans. Now the cocoa beans we don't grow them in Belgium or in Europe anywhere. We grow them in tropical countries in Africa, and so mainly in Africa, but also in Asia, of course. And so you can import cocoa beans and make chocolate, fine chocolates with them, and that will be through a manufacturing process, a transformation, a production, and that will be illustrated by the change in HS code. The HS code of cocoa beans is not the same as the HS code of chocolate bars, because one is a raw material, excuse me, and one is a processed food product. So you can use the same example or the same idea, of course, for any products. You can import flour and make cookies with it. You will be qualified. So that's the first component to understand well. And the second one is what we call the regional value content. And here, I enjoy using this example, even though it's a Canadian product and not a European product. But of course, it works the same way in either direction. And so I enjoy presenting that because, yes, it's a typical Canadian product, right? A skidoo or a snowmobile. Now we should be switching to sea-doos, right? Because we're no longer in winter. We were in winter until a few days ago, and then all of a sudden, summer came up, and we're enjoying very nice summer-like weather right now, at least in Eastern Canada. And so I like to use that example because it's a Canadian product that is assembled in Valcourt in Quebec, but it has European content. It has several European components. First of all, the engines, the motors, they're made in Gunskirchen in Austria. And the tracks are made in Rovaniemi in Finland. So it's a good example to use because it shows us how the rules of origin, the percentage of regional content is calculated. You don't just calculate the European content. You can add the Canadian content that you have in your product. So here, this is the case for BRP. If they export these machines, these skidoos or sea-doos to Europe, then they can add the Canadian content as well as any European content they have, and then that gives them their percentage. Of course, they won't be able to consider any US content or Mexican content or Asian content, but at least the European content can be added to the Canadian content to see what percentage we get and to see if we qualify under the CETA free trade agreement. So same idea, if you have a European product, you could have some foreign components coming from outside of the EU, but you could also have some Canadian parts and components, and then you can add them to the European content to come to the calculation for the rules of origin. And so I'm going to show you examples of what these rules of origin look like by product to, better illustrate that. And then I hope this makes things more clear for you if you are not sure about this before joining us on this webinar. A couple of things that are also important in order to benefit from the CETA free trade agreement, and of course that goes for consumer goods as well, that goes for all products that are covered by the agreement. We have to make sure that our products are shipped directly from Europe to Canada. And here I use an example from personal experience. I don't mention the brand anymore because I thought that was a bit unfair to mention the brand of the company, but I did recently or a few years ago, actually, I bought a lamp made in Germany, and it did not get the benefit of the CETA agreement because it was not shipped directly from Germany to Canada. It was shipped, the German company that makes these lamps, they are high expensive lamps, fancy lamps, and they don't have enough volume in Canada to make it economical to ship their lamps to Canada directly. What they do is they ship them to the US, and then they are distributed across North America from a distribution center in the US, in Georgia, actually, or South Carolina. And so because these lamps are not distributed or not shipped directly between Europe, the EU, and Canada, they lose the preferential treatment. So it's something to keep in mind when we are entering the Canadian market. And so very briefly as well, before we go into the specifics of the consumer goods, I want to remind you about the main principles also when it comes to customs clearance and the tariff elimination and what other components we have to be familiar with. And so one of them that I like to point out is how easy it is and how practical it is for European exporters to sell directly to end users in Canada. And by end users, I mean, for example, for a European company to be able to sell directly to a retailer, you know, like a Loblaws or a Canadian Tire or a Jean Coutu or any companies like that, or the Bay. So it is quite possible, and it's relatively easy for European companies to sell directly to Canadian retailers without necessarily having to have a Canadian importer or distributor, you know, importing the products in Canada. In fact, the European customer, the European exporter, can be what we call a non-resident importer in Canada without necessarily having to have an actual presence, a legal presence in Canada. And that's, I know this is a bit technical, but for those of you who are familiar with this, that is based on the Incoterms, and particularly on the DDP Incoterm. DDP stands for delivered duty paid. It means that the exporter, i.e. in our case here, the European exporter, the European company, would be able to sell DDP to a Canadian retailer and would look after all the shipping costs and all the customs clearance costs, et cetera, and then the European company then becomes a non-resident importer. So it's a very convenient way to start to enter the market, because it does not require any investment into, you know, medium or long-term investment into having a presence, an actual presence here in Canada. It can be managed from Europe without having an entity in Canada and without having fiscal obligations, for example. The key component there, though, is to manage the GST. The GST is the Canadian equivalent to the VAT. Luckily for Canadians, it's not a very high percentage. In Europe, we're used to percentage in the 20% or so, or even in Denmark, it's 25%. In Canada, it's only 5%. So nevertheless, one of the key components of this great strategy that allows a European exporter to sell DDP in Canada and become a non-resident importer, one of the key components is to be properly set up for the GST, and that would be done via a customs broker. So this, of course, would apply to consumer goods as well. Where do we find the applicable tariffs in Canada? This is in a way the equivalent to the TARIC, portal that we have in the EU. So we look that up in the Canadian customs tariff on the CBSA website. And this is where we'll see, for example, that food preparations, I just took an example here because we're getting close to lunch, of food preparations. And so you see the standard rate is 6%. And you see at the bottom on the right-hand side, you see that under the CETA agreement, it's free, which means it's duty-free, it's 0%. So this is where you'd find the information if you want to validate what is the applicable tariff rate in Canada, what is the applicable customs duty. And now there's other products. So let's be honest and about that. There's quite a few products that already enter duty-free in Canada anyway, without the CETA agreement. So a good example of that is in the aerospace industry. Most aerospace parts and components enter Canada duty-free without CETA anyway. And the same would be for machinery, for various products. So for some products, they're coming in duty-free anyway, but for many products, particularly consumer goods, there's pretty high tariffs applicable. And that's what we will look at in detail. We'll look at different industries and see what are the savings for European companies and what are the rules of origin, the applicable rules of origin. So the rules of origin vary a little bit depending on the type of product. And so here, a classic consumer goods, footwear, you know, the duty, the tariff on footwear is pretty high in Canada. It's The highest one is 20%. There's some that are slightly lower. There's some at 15%, but so you see it's a pretty steep tariff. And the rule of origin that you see at the bottom, so all my slides will be structured the same way. The top banner, the top part will be the applicable tariff in Canada without the CETA agreement, right? And then you'll have the CETA mentioned on the right-hand side, where it will say free, i.e. duty-free. And so, and the second component at the bottom of the slide will be the applicable rule of origin for these shoes, these footwear, these boots. And so here you see the rule of origin for goods that fall under Chapter 64 for footwear. Then they just refer to a change of heading or a change. So that means a change of HS code. That means you can have foreign components coming from outside of the EU as long as they have been transformed enough in order to make your footwear, your shoe or your boot or whatnot, and then you'll be okay. You don't need to have a minimum percentage. All you need is a sufficient transformation, as we call it. And that's illustrated by a change in HS code. So that's what the applicable, that's what the saving is for footwear, thanks to the CETA agreement. And some of you might say to yourself, well, do we still make footwear in the EU? Well, I'll be pleased to tell you that I have a very nice pair of shoes that come from Italy. I also have a pair of sporting running shoes from Slovenia. I have slippers from Germany and some from France. So they are not necessarily at the low end. They tend to be at the middle end or at the high end, but nevertheless, we still make these products in Europe, absolutely. And we find them in Canada, and we find more and more of them thanks to the CETA free trade agreement. So 20% is kind of the norm for these types of products. And sufficient transformation is the rule of origin, i.e. you don't need any percentage. You don't have a minimum percentage of regional content to meet for that. If we take other kinds of footwear, you see that would fall also under sporting goods. So soccer or baseball footwear, there the rate is, the tariff would be 17.5%. So it's a bit less than boots. I don't know why, but that's how it is. And you see the rule of origin is the same. The rule of origin is the same for all the products that fall between 6401 and 6405 of the HS code. So that makes reference to a heading. That means that rule of origin applies to most footwear. And again, it's the same as we had on the previous slide. It's the exact same rule anyway. So it refers to sufficient transformation, except for assemblies of inner soles, and so that there's sometimes a little bit of an exception here and there, but the basic principle is you can have foreign components, non-EU raw materials and components, as long as they're transformed enough to manufacture the finished product, you'll be okay. They'll come into Canada duty-free. Here, there's one that's a little bit more tricky, that falls in the category of toys. And we do make toys in the EU. I do find some in Canada here at some fine stores from various EU countries. And so here you see the saving is 8%, because for this one, for tricycles, I mean, the percentage will vary depending on the type of toy, but I use this one for the sake of illustration. And so you see here, CETA gives us thanks to CETA, we get a 0% tariff when we come into Canada. And the rule here is either a transformation, or change of heading, or if you don't have enough of a transformation, then you need to have at least 50% of regional content. So you see, for some products, it just refers to transformation through manufacturing, a change of HS code, change of heading, or change of subheading. And sometimes it brings in the percentage, a minimum percentage. So in your tricycle that you made in the EU and that you exported to Canada, you cannot have more than 50% of non-EU content. So that's what it would be for this specific product. Now, furniture is another commodity where we have quite good and fancy names here, European names here in Canada. Of course, I don't want to mention specific names, but although I have a few that come to mind, but we find European furniture here in Canada, or at least I know we find it in Montreal and in Toronto from various brands or various retailers. And so here you see the saving is substantial. It's almost 10%. And so because the tariff is 9.5%. So here you have to again a similar rule as what we saw for tricycles. You cannot have more. You can have foreign content, non-EU content in your furniture, in the furniture that you're exporting to Canada, but you cannot have more than 50% of it. Of non-EU components. So that gives us a picture for that, an idea for that type of product. Now, earlier I was talking about the lamps. So you see if you're floor standing lamps, which I guess also fall in the furniture category, then the saving is 7%. It's not 9.5%, it's 7%. So this is the thing. This is the trick, I think, also, when we talk about importing and exporting, is that there's a lot of it's all the information is detailed. You really have to pay attention to details. You have to really know how to navigate through these customs documents and these tariff because everything is different. It all looks the same, but for each product will be different. We'll have a slightly different. We'll have a different HS code, of course, but also have a different applicable tariff. And so the rule of origin for furniture that we looked at on the previous slide actually is the same for lamps, because lamps fall under between 9401 and 9406. So the same rule of origin would apply to all these categories that fall within that bracket, within this 9401 to 9406. And so exact same idea as the previous slide where we looked at furniture. If we're exporting jewelry and we find European jewelry, I'm not sure where we find it in Toronto, but in Montreal we find it in Outremont, or and there's quite a few. There's a few shops there, and so here the saving is 8%. And again, we have a similar rule as the rule for furniture. Here you have to you cannot have more than 50% foreign content in your jewelry. Now, some jewelry is at 0%, some is taxable. It depends. It's something we have to look at, in detail, of course, in the customs tariff, always based on HS codes. And for sporting goods. So sporting goods is interesting. We find many, I noticed that we find many skis, for example, in this winter. If you looked at any sporting goods store in Canada, you could see quite a few different brands of skis made in Europe, which is great. And but the interesting part is that they would come in duty-free anyway in Canada. There's no, for many sporting goods are at 0%, particularly skis. So I know it's not the season anymore, but some of you might be thinking about, the season coming up next winter. And so for some products, they're already at 0%, so we don't have to worry about the CETA rules of origin. But for other products, there's pretty hefty tariffs. And so if you're bringing a sailboat or if you're bringing it sails for a sailboat or for windsurfing or whatnot, there the tariff is 16%. And we start seeing the rules of origin making references to specific processes. And so why is that? Is not just a change of HS codes through the transformation of a product. It also refers to a specific process like weaving, coating, etc. And so why is that? Is because we're starting to get into the rules for textiles. And so that's why I put them in this order. because I will end today's presentation on the rules for textiles and garments and apparel, and a big item for European exporters. So this is my way to introduce this idea that for some rules of origin, and we'll see that in a moment, they call for specific processes to be undertaken in the EU or in Canada, allowing you to have foreign inputs, but providing that you have a certain processes done in the EU in order to qualify. So, and here you see sometimes there's different percentages. Most of the products we've seen so far were at 50%, so you could have 50% of foreign content. And here, for this specific product, you cannot have more than 40% of foreign content. But you also have, on top of it, you have to have a certain process to be included. And so, to introduce that notion further, we're not exactly in textile, but similar in carpets. And we make fine carpets in Europe. We still do. I've seen them. Here, the tariff saving is 13%, which is quite nice. And here you see in the rule of origin, it makes references to specific processes. So it's quite precise as to what we need to have in order to meet the rule of origin. And so on the next slides, we're going to look at the rules of origin for garments, for textiles. And so you will see how that is organized. And you will see also that the tariffs in Canada are pretty steep. They're actually quite substantially higher than in Europe on garments. And so the rules on garments and apparel, and remember, you might have noticed that slide. We had a slide at the very beginning where I showed you Annex 5, which had contained the product-specific rules of origin. But if you remember, Annex 1 was specific to garments and apparel, and then Annex 6 was also specific to, that industry. So you see, it shows us, or it illustrates and confirms the fact that for textiles, for garments and apparel, the rules of origin are always very complex. In all free trade agreements, they tend to be the most difficult ones to deal with, and CETA is no different. So we have rules of origin that will make reference to the fact that we can have foreign raw materials, we can have foreign, non-EU cotton or non-EU fiber, as long as we follow this so-called double transformation principle. And so if we meet that double transformation principle, then our products, our garments, will qualify under the CETA Free Trade Agreement. And so what is interesting in that is that there's two levels of rules of origin. We have the first level, which is the regular rule. And then because we agree that the rule is hard to meet, we have exceptions for limited quantities, or exceptions meaning easier rules for a limited quantity. And so this is why you'll hear the term, or you'll see the term quotas for garments and apparel. It's not because, strictly speaking, it's not because there are quotas on European garments coming into Canada. It's because there's quotas for certain quantities with easier rules of origin. And so that's what we'll look at over the next slides. And so you see the different tables of this. So I'll show you examples. I wanted to first share with you the principle of the matter, and then we'll look at examples so you can see exactly what it looks like. And so I took women's or girls' suits and to illustrate that, in our customs tariff, we have men's and women separate. Hopefully, it's only for statistical purposes and for no other purposes. So you see the rate, the standard rate, and that's pretty well the rate for most garments, for most pieces of clothing. The rate is 18%. In Canada, the regular tariff. And of course, with CETA, it takes us to 0% duty-free. And there's slight variations. For some reason, garments made of cotton have a slightly lower tariff Don't ask me why, because I don't know, but that's how it is. So 18% for non-cotton items and 17% for cotton items. And so you see the rule of origin here is going to make reference to precise requirements of what we call the double transformation. So basically, the fiber can be non-EU, or the cotton can be non-EU, but everything else has to be made in the EU, including weaving. And then there's percentages of maximum percentages of foreign content as well. So we have the combination of these of both rules here, and so that's how the standard rule of origin, the standard CETA rule of origin looks like for garments and apparel. And then we'll have exceptions for limited quantities of these products. And so they're found in Annex 6. And here the key word is derogate, which is quite a nice term. It sounds a bit like a classic bureaucrat term, I could say, or maybe a lawyer's term. And so basically what this means is that we saw the rule earlier, we saw the general rule. It's hard to meet, it's demanding, but there's easier rules that can be used. However, for these easier sets of rules, then there's limited quantities that you can enter Canada with. And so that's what they look like. They are in a different annex. They're in table C3. And so here, this is the page or a snapshot of the page that refers to textiles, in general, fabric mainly. And so you see on the left-hand side, it's a classic way of organizing it. It's your HS code on the left-hand side, then the product description, and then you have the quantities that can be imported into Canada or exported from the EU to Canada. And so when it comes to textiles, it's usually in square meters. And we will see on the next slide, it's usually in number of units. And so you see the sufficient production here is easier, it's just weaving. And so that's for textiles. And then in table C4, we start seeing then the actual products, the garments, the clothing. And so you see it's organized by HS code, and then you can get a glimpse of the quantities involved in the center. So it's by unit, number of units. And then on the right-hand side, you see the sufficient production, which is easier to deal with and to follow and to than the regular, the standard rule that we saw earlier. So you see, this is why textiles is complex, because the rules of origin are demanding, and also in some cases there's exceptions. And so we have a good example here of exceptions, and then these exceptions are tied to quantities, to a number of square meters for textiles or fabric, or number of units for jackets and shirts and et cetera, et cetera. And so, of course, that's not, it's a bit demanding to go through that, and you also have to keep a tab of that and keep a count, of course, of that. And so, how is that handled on the Canadian side? In fact, is that, and the way it works is that when a Canadian importer places an order and is about to bring goods in, and when the goods actually come into Canada, so this could be the Canadian importer, which, remember, it could be a European company set up as a non-resident importer. So the way it works is that we have to ask, when we clear goods in Canada, when a goods goes through customs at the port or the airport of entry, then we apply for an import permit, and that is issued by Global Affairs Canada. So this is how it works technically. You have, 10,000 units of men's shirts of cotton that fall in the first category, and they came into the Port of Montreal yesterday, or they're coming in tomorrow. Then you will apply for an import permit from Global Affairs for that quantity. And so this is how these quantities are managed, is via this process, for which any shipment that comes into Canada that falls in that category the importer applies for an import permit that enables the Canadian government to keep track of that and to tell the importers at some point, sorry, I can't give you a permit because we've reached the maximum quantity for the year. So of course, that's not, when that happens, of course, it's not good news and it's not fun, because then we lose the preferential treatment of the CETA agreement, and then we would end up paying the 18% or 17% that we saw earlier. So this is, I wanted to share this with you to show you how it works, also to let you know that it's a type of industry where there's great potential, but and there's great opportunities, because the CETA gives us a great saving of 18% or 17% in some cases, but it comes with a bit of administration and rules that are not necessarily so easy to deal with. However, that's what it is, and it is there. And so the key here is to not get discouraged by the apparent complexity of this, but rather get encouraged by the fact that we have these rules and we have these systems in place, and it's relatively easy to manage. However, you have to be very close to it and pay a lot of attention to details, of course. And so the good news is, the other good news I wanted to share with you is, by sharing this screen here, is the fact that the Canadian government publishes the information as to what has come in, what is the percentage of the quota that has been utilized. And so I know it's a bit hard to read because there's a lot of small figures and characters, but it's just to show you what it looks like. So if you're in that industry, or if you're interested in the Canadian market, you can go and look up what has been the utilization percentage of the CETA agreement of European exporters or European product coming into Canada by category. Again, you recognize on the left-hand side is the good old HS code, right? So that will show us that for women's suits, or one that has the highest utilization, women or girls anoraks and wind cheaters, wind jackets, etc., which I guess we buy in winter, in fall and winter, then we have a pretty high utilization rate of 87%. So that's what it looks like for garments and apparel. In order to benefit, there's exceptions to the demanding rule of origin with easier rules, and but there's limits. In that case, there's limits in the number of units or in the number of square meters, and so that information, of course, is technical. And we need to take the time to really look into it and do our homework, make sure that we are that we have the correct information in order to before we start attacking the Canadian market. And so great opportunities in savings, but demanding in terms of rules of origin and in terms of administration process, and being, of course, proactive on that. And so these are the examples I wanted to show you on the savings, the tariff savings that the CETA has brought for consumer goods. I wanted to show you also how the rules of origin work, because I know that sometimes it can be challenging for SMEs, for new exporters, or for companies that don't do too much export overseas, and so I want to end here with just a couple of considerations to show you also some of the other advantages for CETA, is that we have this protocol on the mutual acceptance of conformity assessments, which means that, generally speaking, a European product that needs to meet certain standards, certain Canadian standards, generally speaking, will be able to have it assessed and certified in Europe. And likewise, for Canadian products that would have to meet European standards, they can be certified, they can be validated and certified in Canada. We don't have to send them to Europe, or vice versa. And so where do we find that information? Because the protocol is great, the CETA protocol is great, but it doesn't actually give you that much practical information. The practical information you'd get from the Standards Council of Canada, here in Ottawa, or for the European Accreditation Office, which is located in Paris. And just to give you examples of the kinds of standards that are applicable in Canada for some consumer goods, you have the CSA standard for some products, the UL standard, the ETL standard. Of course, we talked about garments and apparel, so there's specific requirements for labeling. So, of course, any European company that wants to start selling in Canada must become familiar with these requirements, and as well as the consumer protection requirements. And these are the latter is handled by Health Canada. So of course, these are the things that, depending on the type of product we're going to sell in Canada, that we need to look into what the rules are in Canada, what the standards and the labeling information, et cetera. Remember, as also in Canada, we're bilingual. Every Canadian should speak French and English. They don't always do. However, anything that they buy in stores has to be bilingually labeled. And so here's an example here of a cereal product. All the information has to be both in French and in English across Canada. So that, of course, would apply to any consumer goods. And briefly, I want to end here on briefly talk about the US market. And I enjoy that because I think it's one of the great assets of Canada for European companies, and it's not something that's always obvious or not necessarily promoted as much as it should. So what I want to share with you here is the fact that more than 3/4 of Canadian exports go to the US every year, which means there's very efficient flows and processes in order for goods to cross the Canada-US border. Most of our Canadian exports go to the US year after year. And so Canada is an ideal place to start developing the Canadian market, of course, but then also as a second step to develop the US market from a base in Canada. And so if you're anywhere, in Ontario, anywhere near Toronto, you're only a couple of hours away from the US border, from Buffalo. Same if you're in Quebec or in Montreal, you're about an hour away from Plattsburgh. And so it's very convenient to service the US market from a Canadian base, wherever you are in Canada. I'm talking about Quebec and Ontario, but the same would apply if you were in BC, for example, or in Alberta. And so the key message I want to share with you is that, yes, our European products enter Canada duty-free, thanks to the CETA free trade agreement. And but you could also, depending on the type of product you're making or you're exporting, you could also think about doing some slight transformation in Canada or some slight assembly in Canada to enable you to benefit from the free trade agreement between Canada and the US. And so for there, of course, then we'd have to look at the rules of origin of that specific agreement. But I know companies that do some assembly in Canada to enable them to meet the rule of origin of the North American Free Trade Agreement. So that's the first point. The second point at the bottom that I want to share with you is the fact that the US has a very high duty-free allowance for consumers, and it was increased from $200 to $800 back in 2016. We can't even blame the former US president for that. It was actually the one before. President Obama, who we miss, because they were such a classy family, the Obama family. So under Obama, there was intense lobbying particularly by Amazon, and to increase the duty-free exemption for consumers. And that actually is, that's why. Because of this intense lobbying, the US increased the duty-free allowance from $200 to $800, and that actually explains why e-commerce boomed in the US even before the pandemic. That's when e-commerce took off. And so what does that do to us? Well, what's the advantage that this gives us is the fact that the advantage is that if you are in e-commerce, for example, you could be servicing the US market from a Canadian base, from a Canadian distribution center, because your products will come into Canada duty-free anyway, thanks to CETA, and then you could re-export them to US consumers from a Canadian distribution center very conveniently. We're right next door to the US, and as long as the order is below $800, it comes into the US duty-free. So quite an advantage, quite interesting for European companies. And I know many European companies that do that, by the way. And so that brings me to the end of my presentation. I see time is running out. And so I'd like to hand over the microphone back to Kathy. I thank you all very much for your attention. I hope this was interesting and that you enjoyed it. And I look forward to exchanging with you.
Thank you, Christian, for that very informative presentation. We would invite all of our attendees now to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A function, and we will happily take a stab at them. Just to get us started, like clearly there are many complex aspects of this process, Christian, and I mean, rules of origin, the HS codes. I really enjoyed your drawing the distinction that you drew there between aluminium and how it's being used. Can you give us some insight into like the main challenges that you're seeing companies face when they begin this process?
Well, I would say, Kathy, the main challenge I find, and I find that even more and more nowadays, because I get questions about that, it's the fact that particularly for new exporters and for SMEs, they're a bit intimidated by these rules, you know, by these free trade agreements, these rules of origin, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes also companies imagine that because we have a free trade agreement, we have the same safety rules, or the same, you know, rules for products and this and that. So it's important to make the distinction. There's rules in Europe. There's food safety rules, and they have not changed with CETA. In Canada, there's food safety or consumer protection rules, so they haven't changed. They're still there. We have not harmonized our rules, so that's the first thing that companies sometimes don't realize. So we have to inform ourselves of the applicable rules in the country where we're selling. And the second stumbling block really is companies are a bit intimidated by the rules of origin validation, and because, as we saw, you know, it's pretty complex. It's heavy on details, and so I find that the one of the main stumbling blocks is that companies either get discouraged by the apparent complexity, and to just say, okay, I'm not going to go for it. It's too complex for me, which would be wrong, because it's not actually complex. It's just a question of spending enough time and energy to become familiar with them and understand what they mean, and then make sure we comply. So it's not really the end of the world, but it looks intimidating. So I think that's, for me, that's one of the main stumbling blocks, is that people sometimes don't spend enough time to inform themselves of these technical but very important details. And so then they could run into difficulties with even by having their goods stuck at customs, or even getting penalties from customs, you know, by having issued a certificate of origin that is actually not quite correct. So that happens too. And
I had a follow-up question, but we've got
yes.
a better question. So I'll hold my question. One of our guests is asking, with respect to bilingual labeling for clothing
Yes.
tags, is it sufficient for clothing tags to use the universal symbols and no language text at all?
Oh, that's a good question. I think we need a minimum language. Yes. Yes, I think so. I think there's some requirement for minimum language, and that would be published by Health Canada. So as far as I know, there are minimum requirements. Yes, universal symbols are not sufficient.
He's asking, Frederick is asking specifically with respect to the care instructions. So you're suggesting that, in fact, yes, a certain amount of language is in fact required, not just the symbols.
As far as I know, yes, absolutely.
While we wait to see if some more questions come in, and we do have time, folks, we've got 6 minutes, very happy to take your questions. I might ask, going back then to our previous discussion, Christian, so I'm an SME, let's say, and obviously resources are scarce, both financial resources to get some help around this stuff, but also my own time is such a precious resource. I mean, how important is it, though, as I make my first steps, let's say I'm in Europe and I want to export to Canada, how important as I make these first steps is it to maybe engage a broker to help me with understanding the system better. And what you say are, yes, it's complex, but once you get in there and play around with it, not so complex. It's more about the time. Do you think that it's like most necessary for an SME to use a broker?
Yes, or any help that that will be available. A broker is a relatively wide function, so to speak. So I think if you're referring to a customs broker, so that would be indeed, yes, that would be the case. And it's really important, yes, to spend the time. You see, many companies sometimes tend to focus on which is normal. It's absolutely normal. They tend to focus on the product development, and on the market development. What is the potential in that market? You know, what are consumers buying, and where are the trends? So, of course, that's crucial. That you have to start with that. But the key, I think, is not to forget that validating rules of origin, conformity, compliance, customs issues should not be left to the last moment. That should be done as well. You know, part of the whole assessment. Sometimes it happens. You know, companies will say to themselves, "Oh well, we'll figure that out at the last moment." Unfortunately, it's not possible anymore, because these free trade agreements, let's not forget, they make things a lot easier in principle, but in practice they don't. In practice, there's more rules. You know, so that's the thing that we sometimes don't keep in mind. The rules of trade are not necessarily getting easier or simpler. They're in fact getting a bit more complex, and that's in part because of these free trade agreements. So they're great tools, that they're great opportunities, but they come with requirements to spend time and energy to become very familiar with the rules that apply.
Understood. Well, look, I'm not seeing any other questions. It was a very thorough presentation, and it might be one of those things where people go back. So we are recording this, folks, and you'll have access. I think this is the kind of presentation that warrants another listen. There's so much to it. So we might see people come back to it and then email us with questions. Okay, look, one is coming in at the final hour here. There is a great interest of European companies producing textile garments designed in Europe, but produced in China. What will be the treatment? Terrific question.
All right, so Jose Luis, is a good question, and I thank you for asking it, because it reminds me to say something that I didn't say so far. It's the fact that the origin of a product is not where it was designed or not where it was sold from. It's always where it was manufactured or it was produced. So if a European company is getting garments manufactured in China, the European company might be the seller, might be producing the commercial invoices, could be the importer of record. Actually, that's fine, that's easy. But the origin of the product will be China. It will stay. Like the origin of the product remains with the product, even if it was shipped, you know, from China to Europe and then from Europe to Canada. It keeps its origin. So that's a very important point. So let's remember that as well. A free trade agreement enables us to have foreign inputs, to have foreign components, raw materials, and parts in our finished products. But if our finished products are made outside of the EU, China or elsewhere, then they at no time get the EU origin. They keep their origin of wherever they were made, even if they were not shipped directly. And it's a very good point, because there's also new compliance issues that I wanted to touch on, but I left it aside in the interest of time. But I think we might as well touch on it very briefly. You know, there's new rules in the US that want to prevent the entry of goods from the Uyghur or Xinjiang region of China, and it's called the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. And it has a huge impact on Canadian exporters or European exporters, because if you export products into the US that come from that part of China, the US will block it, will seize it. And so there's new compliance requirements that are pretty stiff, because if you were, for example, if you were in Europe and if you were importing cotton from China and then make your material in Europe, you could still be subject to that US rule. So we have more and more. So just to summarize, yeah, the origin of a product is where the product was actually made or grown or manufactured, but also we have more and more severe or hard to stiff requirements for traceability of the source of the components. So it's something that's getting more important for companies. It is very new. It's quite demanding for SMEs, because multinationals, of course, have the resources, usually, and the SMEs don't. And so does China has a textile agreement with Canada? No, actually, Canada is following the US trend to try to prevent any goods originating from China that could have been made at any time with forced labor. And so the EU is doing the same as well. There's legislation that's being written in the EU right now that should be in effect towards the end of the year. There's a general trend to be to follow that closely and to prevent these components from China.
And we've got our own bill in Canada that we're looking at right now, aren't we? On
Exactly, we have
laws?
yes. What's a bit striking is that the Canadian rule is very it's like is a lot easier than the US rule. So we'll have to see what the EU rule is going to be. Is it going to be a US style, very specific and demanding rule, or is it going to be Canadian style, maybe more flexible?
That might warrant another webinar perhaps this summer. Breaking news, watch it here, folks.
Absolutely.
Look, it's 12:01. Well, it's 12:01 in Eastern Standard Time, and thank you very much also for welcoming our guests from Eastern Canada on the Atlantic coast there. Indeed, you were in the afternoon. So I think we're going to wrap it up, folks, but thank you for your most excellent questions, and thank you very much, Christian, for this presentation. Please, folks, do follow us on social media and check out the website from time to time. You will be able to access this webinar. And if you happen to be in Toronto on the 27th of April, UCAN is hosting its annual EU Canada Business Day. Fantastic lineup of speakers and panelists. There's still some spots open. Registration has been very popular, so not a lot of spots open, but you can access that. It's on social media. It's also on our website. If you want to grab one of those spots, it's remaining. I think it will be a most wonderful morning for networking and understanding complex agreements like these ones. Wishing you all a very lovely day. It's a phenomenal and hot day here in Eastern Canada, so I hope the rest of you are enjoying that. And thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye, Kathy.